A group of scientists who were investigating the North Pole believed they were alone on this frozen plain of land. But they got the fright of a lifetime when they encountered about a dozen frozen statues. When they went to check them out, the scientists suddenly realized these were not statues at all. Their bizarre discovery would end up making headlines all around the world. Even with all the pictures the scientists had taken of their discovery, people still had difficulty believing anything they were saying. Their story just sounded so far-fetched and almost like a bad conspiracy. But the evidence was clear for everybody to see. Only after some news outlets started sending people to the coordinates of these statues themselves to confirm the outrageous claims of the scientists did the world start to wake up to the reality of the situation. Maybe they did not know everything about the North Pole after all. Like most expeditions, the instructions were clear and straightforward, but this wasn't any ordinary expedition. Sure, every trip had its surprises, but this was going to be a trip like no other, and it was going to make headlines. After all, this was a very different surprise, and it was like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Things had started strangely from when they first entered the base. Maybe it had just been the weather or the ever-present chill, but something was off. There was a general bad feeling in the air, as if something would go wrong at any moment, and that feeling would prove itself right. The scientists were there for a standard expedition. The melting of ice caps was an ongoing study, and it required constant supervision. Global warming is very serious, and they were very passionate about their jobs, which made their discovery even more surprising. The scientists' arrival at the base was strange. They were excited to get on with the study and take over the current team's efforts, but when they arrived, the other team had already left. The study was supposed to be constantly manned, but they were gone. What could have pulled them away from the base? It was very disturbing. The scientists tried to reach out for answers from their contacts, but because of the bad weather, communications were limited. They never got a clear answer as to where the former team had gone. Did they leave early because of the weather, or did they abandon the project? And even worse, did they ever make it home? The team wasn't sure what else to expect, but the next 2 weeks went mostly according to plan. The weather was still not playing nicely, and communication was made even more difficult. The general bad feeling still hung in the air. Everyone wanted to know what happened to the former team. Were they safe here? The study was going relatively well until a scientist was alerted to a radio picking up a signal. They woke up the rest of the scientists and asked the radio to repeat the message. The 4 of them were groggy and tired, but once they heard the message, they were wide awake. It was a distress call. The radio signal was weak and kept cutting out, but the cries for help were unmistakable. The person directly on the line kept repeating a set of coordinates. The scientists quickly wrote them down and kept trying to talk to the person on the other end, but the weather was getting harsher. Things were about to get worse. The signal died. The scientists were unsure what to do next. They had been told that they were alone at the base and that no other bases nearby were being currently manned. It was freezing this time of year and very dark. It was dangerous, and it was only with the permission of the government that they'd been able to come. Who else could be here? The scientists had to do something. It had been a distress call after all. Someone out there needed help, more than someone by the sound of the call. The coordinates that had been repeated weren't that far away from the base. There wasn't any other good choice. They had to go there. Travel would be difficult. The coordinates would usually be a few hours of hiking from the base, but with the weather, it'd likely take a full day. It would be difficult, but not impossible. But what about the people who needed help? Could they survive the day? Or would the scientists be too late? The coordinates were also somewhere the scientists hadn't ventured before. It was close, but in a different direction from their study. It was also outside of their normal circle of travel. They'd need special permission to go, but would they be able to get it with the storm kicking out the communication? The scientists attempted to radio their superiors, but the communication lines were still completely down. Getting permission wasn't an option, and they were wasting time. The group had to get out to the coordinates to help whoever was out there. They needed to get moving if they were going to find anyone alive. There was no debate about leaving. The scientists all agreed that they would take the risk to save whoever was out there. They prepared as fast as they could. It wasn't smart to leave just then without taking all of the necessary precautions, which included setting up their study to be unmanned for a few days. Finally, they were ready to set out. The scientists weren't ready to leave until the next morning. They all felt horrible having to wait, but it was safest this way. If they were to save anyone, they needed to be as cautious as possible to not get killed on the way there. And even with all the precautions, the environment was unpredictable and dangerous. The trip was difficult, but they had to execute it. The day of travel was quickly slowed down as the weather got worse, something that didn't even seem possible. But they were making slow progress, and by the time they were closing in on the coordinates, all of the researchers were worn out. And even worse, there wasn't any clear sign of anyone yet. The plan was to find the people and help them back to the base. But things were getting difficult, and everyone was tired. It looked like they were going to have to make camp and rest. But they all thought about the radio call they'd gotten. They couldn't leave the people there to suffer. The scientists made their way over the last icy hill before reaching the coordinates. It had been a long and very difficult journey. They speculated the whole way there how anyone could have gotten out here without them knowing about it. And even more, how they got there without their superiors knowing about it. The group thought that maybe they'd see a plane or helicopter. Maybe the people who needed help had only just arrived. But there was no wreckage, no signs of a plane or helicopter. In fact, there was something completely different and very bizarre. No one knew just what they were looking at. The storm had lightened just enough that they could make out something in amongst the snow and ice. It was strange and didn't seem possible. It looked like there was an old house surrounded by a small stone wall. There were even what looked like bare trees in a garden. What was going on here? But that wasn't all. All around the garden were figures standing. They looked human-like. Had the people who needed help frozen out here? It looked awful. What had happened? How was all of this real? The scientists had no answers, but they knew if those were frozen people, they were likely dead. But they had to get a closer look. Most of the scientists were stunned into silence. They had no clue what to do except to get closer. What kind of horrors would be there once they got closer? The house and garden didn't make sense, but if these really were the people who needed help, this was a disaster. The scientists rushed toward the figures as fast as their thick clothing would allow. The storm was lessening up, but that didn't make the trip any less dangerous. They needed to know what was going on. Nothing made sense, and they had traveled all this way. They were going to get answers. When they got closer, they rushed toward one of the figures. They took the risk and took off their protective goggles to get a better look at what was before them. The figures were statues, and so was almost everything in this garden. But that didn't explain anything. What was the recording for, and how did all of this get here? They decided to walk a little further to take in everything quietly. In the distance, they saw an object that looked like a hut. As they got closer, they saw that it was an abandoned lodge. What could that mean so close to those strange images? They wondered if it was wise to knock. After some deliberation, they decided to knock. But no one opened the door. They regrouped, and together, slowly, they approached the door. To everyone's surprise, after one of the scientists had slightly pushed and pulled the doorknob, they discovered that the entrance to the house was unlocked. Surely nobody could be able to live in this remote place that was so hard for them to reach, right? The team went in, and things started to become even stranger. The interior of the house was in surprisingly good shape, and all the facilities seemed to be present. There was even food in the cupboards, as if someone had been there recently. Could the person who made the distress call before be living in this house? After having investigated the house, the scientists decided that they had to stay there for a while and take a break. After getting rid of their outer layer of clothing, they decided that it would be best to spend the night here at least. The reason was that they had to regain some strength, and also a potential resident could show up. The evening came quickly, and it did not take long for the academic team to each find a place to lay down, and most of them slept immediately. Everyone seemed to be tired from the hike, although one of the scientists, Matthew, could not catch any shut-eye. The man could not get the strange statues out of his mind. Everything they had discovered today was exceptionally strange, but still, the statues were especially weird and almost scary, Matthew thought. There had to be a logical reason for the objects to be here. Not anyone among the living here could explain it, and it frustrated the man to the point where he suddenly stood up. Not being able to sleep anyway, Matthew decided to peek through the only window of the house. He saw that the storm was gone completely, and before he could change his mind, he was already back in his winter shoes and at the door. The researcher felt that he really needed to further inspect those statues. Maybe he had missed something when he first looked at them? He opened the door silently and got out. It was still blistering cold outside, but with the storm gone and a full moon, at least he could see through his snow glasses now. Matthew walked up to one of the statues and whipped some of the snow from it. He now took his magnifying glass and inspected the object from the bottom to the top as closely as he could. After a couple of minutes, he could determine that the strange bodies were actually made from some form of stone or metal. At least, this was until he really started to look in the statue's eyes. The researcher's own eyes went wide open when he noticed it. Suddenly, many things that had raised so many questions before started to click in his mind. Matthew took a small step back and shouted as hard as he could towards the house that, if anyone from his team heard this, it would be important to come outside. He thought that familiar human voices from inside of the house could be heard. While he was waiting for action from anyone there, Matthew decided to quickly take a couple of photos. He needed proof of what he had just discovered. Otherwise, it could be that nobody was ever going to believe him. Another female scientist was now indeed woken up and coming towards him after having closed the door behind her. When the woman was coming closer, she was suddenly stopped in her tracks after being about halfway between the house and Matthew. She was urging me to continue, but could not move anymore. The only movement that she could manage to make was from her arm. The female scientist was pointing in Matthew's direction with a shaking hand. Matthew did not understand what was happening with his colleague until he realized that she was not pointing at him, but at something behind him. Matthew realized this and turned around quickly, and when he did, the scientist finally understood his colleague's reaction. He was shocked, but also relieved. This must be the explanation for the distress call from before. It had to be. And then, a fear came over him. They needed to get out of here quickly. About 3 months have passed since this point. The scientists had been back home safe and sound for a while now. When they'd struggled back their way to base camp, they had immediately called the project supervisor on the mainland. It was immediately requested to send a flight there and to take them home. For the last couple of months, actually, since the week they got back, the academic group had been trying to tell the world about what they had unexpectedly encountered that faithful day at the North Pole. But even with the pictures that Matthew had made over there, almost nobody would believe them. They tried this for days with the whole team, but as it turned out, only one news station was interested in the story. Even this station was not going to publish anything without any proof, and thus their board decided to send a team and check out this mystery for themselves. This was an unexpected twist. The team of researchers was relieved that their scientific credibility was finally accepted by at least one organization. They decided to accept the request to share the location and provided all the information with the exact coordinates of the statues. The news station managed to organize an expedition to find proof, and finding proof they did. When the expedition returned about 2 weeks later, the news station was immediately willing to publish the full story. They included an introduction from the whole scientist team, their original objective on the North Pole, and additionally Matthew with a main role. The article was published 3 days after and completely shocked the world. Apparently, the North Pole was not as thinly inhabited as many people might have expected. A certain area had been inhabited by criminals since they had started to store some of their loot in this deserted place. This selection of criminals had over the years created a true hideaway for themselves there. It had been a complete success story until now. The criminals could conduct business here without anyone in the world watching. They found, after having investigated the area together with an international police team, many stolen items, especially a wide variety of statues that were stolen from private collections years ago. The thieves in question have been storing the mostly golden statues here in a large and frozen garden. The station's investigation team expected that the figures were stored here until they could be sold to the highest bidder. A jetty and a cargo boat had also been found nearby that were probably being used to transport the items. Surprisingly, it did not take the international research team too long to find most of the people responsible to be arrested. Already before the article got published, the suspects were put on trial, while another team of researchers was appointed to determine the statue's owners so that they could be returned rightfully. This discovery of the scientists really put the North Pole on the map and led to the whole world talking about this area. Eventually, the whole chain of events resulted in the North Pole being policed significantly more so that nobody could use this place anymore as a cover for their criminal activities.